Before millions, Jasmine Crockett confronted Sean Hannity. He blames the poor shields the rich and sells outrage for ratings. He mocked the hungry. She showed the CEO cashing dividends while workers starved. He sneered journalism. She thundered exploitation. What shocking proof flipped his entire narrative upside down. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room was packed by 8:57 a.m. Reporters from every major outlet lined the back wall, their lenses fixed not just on the witness table, but on the woman who had just walked in without saying a word. Jasmine Crockett. Calm, composed, precise. The mahogany walls of the congressional chamber seemed to tighten as she approached her seat. This wasn't just another hearing. It was a moment loaded with intent, a public reckoning between political power and media manipulation. At the top of the schedule, special hearing on the socio-economic impact of corporate media on the American working class. The name sounded technical, but everyone in the room knew exactly what it meant. Sean Hannity would finally be asked to explain the monster his voice had helped build. He was already seated, clean Navy suit, Fox News tie pin, gleaming under studio-grade lighting. Hannity looked comfortable, smug, even one hand resting lazily on the desk. He watched Jasmine approach, and before she could even sit, let the first drop of contempt fall into the water. So he said, smirking toward the cameras, "Is this a congressional hearing or a feelings class run by the left wing?" A few aides chuckled. One congressman stifled a laugh. Hannity leaned back like a man playing to a studio audience, not a federal institution. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she placed a black case onto the desk in front of her, with both hands slowly and firmly, like someone setting down the weight of a nation's silence. The latch snapped open. No theatrics, just one thick folder, 3 inches deep, marked in bold red, Exhibit A. Jasmine didn't glance at Hannity or the press. She opened it in silence, eyes fixed on the mic. The soft shuffle of paper cut through the room's tension. Hannity's grin faltered. She hadn't spoken, but he'd already lost control. And when she finally did speak, it wasn't to defend herself. It was to indict the system that let a man like him sit on primetime television and profit from fear. Jasmine Crockett reached for the remote with a stillness that could cut glass. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, as though she were activating something far more consequential than just to screen something elemental. The chamber's lights dimmed at the edges, not dark enough to feel theatrical, but just enough for the glare of the monitor behind her to seize control of the room. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't announce what was coming. She simply pressed play. A video flickered to life, a clip from the Sean Hannity show, time-stamped in the lower corner. The audio was clean. Hannity's face filled the screen, mid-rant, eyes-wide voice. Confident, soaked in certainty. White working-class Americans are being replaced by lazy immigrants in the Democrats' welfare agenda. The chamber didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was more honest than any reaction. Across the room, staffers looked at each other with unease. Members of Congress shifted, arms crossed. The words felt radioactive, not because they were shocking, but because they had been repeated so often outside these walls that hearing them in this room made them feel newly dangerous. Hannity, still seated, folded his arms. His expression stayed fixed, but there was a flicker, a blink, just a moment too slow. Crockett didn't glance at him. She watched the screen like a surgeon watches a tumor being revealed in a scan, clinical focused, without pity. The clip ended. The screen went black. She didn't fill the silence. She let it sit, let the echo of his voice hang like smoke in a collapsed mine. Then, without a word, she stepped forward and lifted a single piece of paper from the thick file marked Exhibit A. She held it aloft, steady and unshaking. "Let's start with facts," she said, and her voice wasn't loud, but it was the only voice that mattered. Immigrants account for less than 5% of all federal healthcare assistance recipients. Not 50, not 15. 5. She lowered the page and placed it carefully on the desk in front of her, the way a judge might place a verdict. This is data from Pew Research and Brookings, not talking points, not political spin, just math. She pulled out another page, a color-coded map showing the rise of poverty in rural white counties across the U.S. And poverty, she continued, it's rising fastest in the very places your show claims are being overrun. But not because of immigrants, because of corporate monopolies, because of hospital closures, because of a rigged system that lets the rich escape accountability, while the working class gets told to blame their neighbors. Her voice didn't waver. It compressed every syllable tighter, sharper. She didn't sound angry. She sounded surgical, like someone cutting away a lie that had wrapped itself around a nation's throat. Then came the final image. Jasmine tapped the remote again. The screen lit up with a grainy photo, a real woman around 35 standing in line at a grocery store. In one hand, she held a government-issued welfare card to pay for food. Her other hand rested gently on her child's head, holding him close. Her face looked tired, careful, and invisible in the way poor people often are. The room was quiet. Jasmine didn't rush. She let everyone take in the image before she spoke, and when she did, her voice was low but steady. Mr. Hannity, your show talks about working-class Americans every night, but you never mention the companies that shut down their factories. You never mention the executives who sent jobs overseas. You never mention the people at the top making hundreds of times more than their workers. But you always mention women like her. She gestured to the screen, her hand hovering over the mother's face. Why do you target the woman feeding her kids with food stamps, but never the billionaire eating from tax loopholes? The question wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was clean, perfectly framed, impossible to dodge. The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was paralyzing. Hannity sat still. The room waited, but nothing came, because in that moment he had no answer. And just when it seemed she might let the silence stretch further, Jasmine moved again, not with anger, but with precision, as if cutting deeper into something that had long gone untouched. She turned toward the screen and raised a single sheet from the folder marked Exhibit A. With a flick of her wrist, the monitor behind her lit up again, this time with a graphic that bled red and black. The title read, Fox News Coverage of Poverty, a Decade in Review. Beneath it, a number burned into the room, 91%. Jasmine spoke clearly, not with rage, but with the quiet coldness of someone holding undeniable proof. According to Media Matters, 91% of Fox News coverage about poor Americans is negative. As she spoke, images rotated behind her reel headlines, pulled from the network's broadcasts: Welfare Queens Destroying America, Handouts Kill Work Ethic, America's Growing Parasite Class. The faces in those clips were consistent. Nearly all were black or brown, most of them women, and none of them CEOs. Jasmine didn't add commentary. She didn't have to. The imagery had already passed judgment on itself. She lifted the remote again, and a second video began to play. It was another clip from the Sean Hannity show. The studio lights bright, the graphics bold, his voice unwavering. Every dollar you pay in taxes goes to feed people who do nothing but have more kids. The audio boomed through the chamber like a public indictment, except it wasn't Hannity on trial. Not yet. It was every person who had ever heard those words and swallowed them as truth. The implication wasn't subtle. The coded language wasn't hidden. The target was obvious and painfully familiar. Across the room, a few heads dropped. One congressman shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. Jasmine let the clip run a moment longer than necessary until it felt uncomfortable to everyone in the room, especially Hannity, whose face, while outwardly calm, had started to lose its usual polish. Then Jasmine turned back to the audience. Not the politicians, not the press, but the millions watching from places Hannity's cameras had never cared to visit. Slowly, with reverence, she pulled out a creased letter from a worn envelope. She held it carefully, like something sacred. This is from a woman in Appalachia, she said. White, mother of 3, works full-time at Walmart. Her voice softened, but didn't tremble. She wrote to me after her son lost his job during COVID. He watched your show every night. She said. Jasmine stopped to glance down, her eyes moving over the faded print like a prayer. Then she read it aloud. She said, my son started believing it was black people who took his job. That's what Hannity told him. Not the executives, not the system, the neighbor down the street. The letter lowered. Her shoulders stayed squared. No dramatics, no tears. Just the weight of a quiet truth laid bare. The room was silent, not in awe, but in reckoning, because everyone understood what had just happened. Jasmine hadn't accused. She had revealed. The damage wasn't hypothetical. It had names, mothers, pay stubs, grief. And when she turned to Hannity, finally purposefully, the moment hardened. Her voice was colder now, not from anger, but from absolute clarity. "Tell me, Mr. Hannity," she asked, "where's the justice in making workers fight other workers, while the men who close their factories fly to tax havens and smile?" There was no reply, only the sound of everyone in that chamber finally listening. The damage wasn't just emotional, it was financial, and Jasmine Crockett was ready to show exactly who profited from it. She reached back into her folder, pulled out a thick black report, and placed it flat on the table in front of her. The seal on the front read, "Securities and Exchange Commission, Public Filings." With one calm motion, she tapped the remote again. The screen behind her shifted from charts to something far more recognizable: corporate logos. ExxonMobil, Johnson and Johnson, Raytheon. They appeared one by one, bold and unavoidable. Jasmine stood still for a moment, letting the weight of those names settle into the air. Then she spoke, slow, clear, and deliberate. "These," she said, turning toward the panel, "are some of the biggest companies that advertise on Fox News. That means these are the people paying for your airtime, Mr. Hannity." She let that sit. Oil companies, drug companies, defense contractors. Not exactly the voice of the working class. The gallery stayed quiet. Jasmine then flipped to the next page, a clean chart showing dates, headlines, and stock prices rising like stairs. The screen behind her updated again. According to official SEC filings, she said, holding the document up for all to see, in the exact 3 weeks that Fox News ran back-to-back segments attacking Medicare expansion, private health insurance stocks went up. Fast, almost 9%. The graph on the screen lit up in red, marking the rise. "Your show told millions of Americans that Medicare for all was dangerous," she added. "Meanwhile, the people who sell insurance, the ones who would lose billions, were quietly getting richer." Across the room, even those who'd scoffed earlier had gone quiet. The implication wasn't hidden. It was highlighted. It wasn't political. It was financial. That's when Hannity interrupted. His voice came sharp, more defensive than before, but wrapped in a tired smirk. "I'm a journalist, not their accountant." Jasmine didn't even blink. She kept her eyes on him, steady, calm, unshaken, and responded with a line that didn't need to be repeated to hit like a verdict. "You don't need to be their accountant. You just need to know who's signing the checks and what you said right after you cashed them." No one moved. No one spoke. And in that moment, what Jasmine had built wasn't just an argument, it was a mirror. And Hannity, for the first time, had to look into it. And just when the silence after the money trail seemed to settle, Jasmine turned the page, not to escalate, but to reveal the most painful part: what came next and who paid the real price. She walked back toward the center of the room and pointed to the screen. With a single press of the remote, a giant white number appeared on a black background: $1.5 billion. It wasn't stylized. It wasn't dramatized. It was cold, corporate, and real. Jasmine turned to the chamber. "That's how much Fox News made in advertising revenue between 2016 and 2020, she said calmly. "But what matters more is when they made the most." She clicked again. A new chart appeared, a simple bar graph with bold red spikes in the years and months when the country was torn apart. Labels sat beneath each bar like bruises: Charlottesville, Ferguson, Minneapolis, Kenosha. Fox's biggest profits came during social unrest, Jasmine said, when people were marching in the streets, when the country was grieving, when mothers were burying their children. Her voice didn't rise, it focused. That's when the ratings went up. That's when the advertisers paid more. And that's when your show ran hotter than ever. She let that truth hang in the air like smoke after a fire. Then she moved back to the desk, lifted a folder from her case, and held it up so the cameras could see the cover: Dominion lawsuit, internal exhibits. Her hand was steady. "This is part of the evidence used in the Dominion case against Fox News," she said. "It contains internal emails, not from activists, not from Democrats, but from inside the network itself." She clicked the remote again, and the screen changed. This time, no charts, just a single quote in large, highlighted in yellow. "I did not believe for 1 second that the Dominion software altered the outcome in any way." The author's name and date were printed beneath it: Sean Hannity, November 2020. Jasmine turned back to face him. She didn't speak right away. She wanted the words to land. You knew the truth, she said. You didn't believe the election was stolen, but you went on air night after night and pushed that story anyway. You let people think their country had been taken from them. You didn't just fan the flames, you handed them the match. Hannity suddenly leaned forward, his tone sharp, trying to cut her off. That's the liberal interpretation. A left-wing twist on what we said. But Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She held the email in her hand and looked him in the eye. Her reply came out calm, low, and unshakable. No. That's a quote from your own email. There was nothing left to argue. His words were on the record in writing in front of the nation. And this time they weren't being broadcast, they were being read back to him under oath. And if numbers weren't enough, if revenue charts and internal emails still felt like abstractions, Jasmine Crockett reached for what couldn't be graphed loss. She slid her hand back into the folder and slowly lifted a single letter. It was enclosed in a plastic sleeve neatly folded, but clearly worn from being read over and over. Her thumb pressed gently along the crease in the middle before she raised her eyes to the room. This letter, she said, was written by a woman from Missouri. She asked that her name not be shared, but she gave me full permission to read her words here today. Her voice wasn't trembling. It was quiet, like someone opening a door they didn't want to. She looked down and read it aloud, every word deliberate. My husband watched Mr. Hannity every night. He believed what he heard. When he got sick, he said it was just fake flu. He wouldn't see a doctor. He said it was all hype. He said Mr. Hannity said not to panic. By the time he couldn't breathe, it was too late. Now my son doesn't have a father. Jasmine stopped reading. She didn't fold the letter. She kept holding it like the weight of it might disappear if she let go. The chamber was completely still, no coughing, no shuffling, not even the click of a pen. Then in a tone lower and slower than anything she had said all morning, she looked straight at Hannity and spoke the only words that mattered. That man trusted you all the way to the grave. She let that line settle into the room like ash. Hannity stared back. No smirk, no confidence. But he didn't apologize. When he finally spoke, his tone was clipped, emotionally neutral, like someone reading a disclaimer. I'm not responsible for the personal decisions of every American citizen. It wasn't a defense. It was a refusal. Jasmine stood her ground. Her hands didn't move. Her gaze didn't shift. And when she responded, she didn't raise her voice. She narrowed it, sharpened it. Then what are you responsible for? No one answered, because there was no script for that moment, only a reckoning that had finally arrived. And just when the grief in Jasmine's voice had hushed the chamber, Hannity leaned back and let a smirk break across his face, cold. Practiced the kind of smile made for cable news, not human suffering. He adjusted his cuffs slightly, tilted his chin, and spoke like a man reading lines he'd said 1,000 times. You seem to enjoy turning everything into a conversation about race and class. He said, the sarcasm in his tone so sharp it nearly masked the contempt. I'm here to talk about truth, not sit through a sociology lecture. The words weren't shouted, but they hit the air like a slap. A few heads turned. One staffer behind the dais stifled a grin. For Hannity, it was theater. But for Jasmine, it was confirmation in the moment when performance fully replaced responsibility. Still, she didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes or look away. Instead, she calmly reached for the remote on the table, tapped once, and turned the screen behind her into a mirror no one could avoid. The display was stripped of drama, no spinning headlines, no sound bites, just a stark corporate document, Executive Compensation Report, U.S. Media Networks. A single line near the center glowed red on the digital board, highlighted for the nation to see. Jasmine stood tall, hands, still voice steady. In 2022, she said, reading directly from the report, the CEO of Fox Corporation earned 420 times more than the network's lowest paid employee. No opinion, no emphasis, just data, just truth. She let the sentence land, then lowered the page and raised her eyes. And then came the question, the kind that didn't demand volume to feel like thunder. If you truly stand with American workers, why are you silent when they get laid off by the hundreds? While your CEO flies in from the Bahamas just to increase shareholder dividends? Her tone didn't rise. It sank like a stone hitting the deepest part of a lake. The words were clean, too clean, and that's what made them dangerous. She wasn't arguing anymore. She was auditing him, not just his show, not just his politics, his silence. And in that silence, the room felt something shift, not because someone shouted, but because someone finally asked what mattered. And as the silence from her final question began to settle into the walls, Jasmine Crockett didn't step back. She stepped closer, not physically, but emotionally, psychologically, into the precise space where truth becomes unbearable and yet unavoidable. She had taken the facts, the charts, the emails, the letter, and laid them bare. But now, standing in the center of a room, lit by history and broadcast in real time, she delivered the one thing that couldn't be measured, a challenge not to Sean Hannity's politics, but to his conscience. She didn't rush. She let the previous exchange, the exposed pay gap, the unanswered grief, the spinning denials hang in the air, just long enough for the room to absorb it like a bruise forming beneath the skin. Then she spoke, each word delivered with precision, calm, and finality, not as a blow, but as a quiet blade twisting with purpose. "You don't have to answer me, but maybe you should ask yourself this." She paused, not for effect, but for clarity. Her gaze didn't waver. Her body didn't shift. She wasn't leaning in for theater. She stood still, so still the room felt like it was leaning toward her. Then her voice dropped into something colder, something unignorable. "When you speak at 8 p.m. each night, do you help working people understand who's really taking the food off their table?" That was it. No dramatic accusation, no grandstanding, just a question. But it was the kind of question that once asked can never be unasked. The kind that reverberates through institutions, through careers, through the flat-screen TVs mounted on living room walls across the country. It was a question soaked in everything that had come before it: the charts about wealth disparity, the reports of manipulated fear, the mother's letter about a husband who died believing the lie. And now it had been distilled into one single moment of quiet fire aimed directly at the man who had spent decades shaping what millions believed to be true. The chamber didn't react immediately. It couldn't. The tension had become something real, something solid like a pane of glass suspended between speaker and subject. The room had been loud with silence before, but now it was total. No one looked down. No one whispered. The cameras floating silently above like courtroom specters slowly turned their gaze. They did not rush. They panned slowly, deliberately, as if even the machines understood that this was the moment the story had been building toward. The lens found him. Sean Hannity sat motionless, but not still. His hands, once lazily folded on the desk, were now tightly clasped, fingers curling into one another, knuckles drawn white beneath the camera lights. His chest rose not quickly, but with just enough tension to betray control. And then his eyes moved not to her, not to the data on the screen, not even to the chairman. They drifted downward as if instinctively avoiding the weight in the room. His face was neither outraged nor remorseful, but suspended between defiance and recognition, like a man realizing that the script in his hand was no longer enough to survive the scene he was in. To anyone watching from home, it was clear the power had shifted. No gavel struck, no interruption broke the moment, but something had changed. The woman who had entered the hearing room carrying a folder was now carrying the moral center of the debate, and everyone could feel it. She had not come to argue with a host. She had come to confront a machine, and she had done it with a tone so even, so surgically calm, that when the pressure hit its peak, there was no explosion, only implosion. Cameras lingered. One zoomed tighter on Hannity's hand still clenched. Another captured the faint flicker in his left eye as it broke contact with the chamber and drifted toward the marble floor. A third caught Jasmine, not gloating, not smug, but resolute. Her eyes held the same clarity they had when she read the Missouri mother's letter, because the moment was not about victory, it was about reversal, not in law, in perception, in truth. No one interrupted her. No one needed to, because nothing she could say next would be stronger than the silence Hannity gave her in return. That silence was his answer. And in politics and public discourse, the things a person refuses to answer are often louder than what they choose to say. From the back of the room, a staffer shifted slightly in her seat, scribbling something short on a notepad, then stopped. She looked up, uncertain if the moment was over. Reporters didn't move either. The stillness in the air had turned to pressure, the kind that makes pens stop moving, hearts beat louder, and ambition go quiet. In that long, heavy pause, the question remained suspended in the air, like a verdict still echoing. You don't have to answer me, but maybe you should ask yourself this. When you speak at 8 p.m. each night, do you help working people understand who's really taking the food off their table? It was not a line written for headlines. It was not a line engineered for social media sound bites. It was a confrontation with the cost of selective storytelling laid at the feet of a man who had made a living selling simplicity to a country choking on complexity. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her hands in triumph. She didn't smirk or lean back. She stood still, quiet, composed the way someone stands at the end of a burial. Not for the man in front of her, but for the illusions he had helped build, illusions now cracked, exposed, and slowly beginning to collapse under the weight of their own convenience. And that was the climax. Not with a bang, not with a shout, but with a silence too honest to escape. The silence in the hearing chamber may have ended, but across the nation it had just begun to echo. By the time the clock struck midnight on the East Coast, clips of Jasmine Crockett's final words to Sean Hannity had already begun ricocheting through every major platform. On Twitter, it exploded not as a trending hashtag, but as a storm of clips, captions, and slow-motion breakdowns. On TikTok, creators dissected her posture, her tone, her stillness, calling it the calm before an intellectual detonation. Cable outlets scrambled to license the footage, and by the morning of the second day, the number was confirmed: 50 million views in under 48 hours. But it wasn't just a viral moment. It was a reckoning. CNN opened its primetime broadcast with her final sentence, not in a clip, but as a banner headline across the screen. Jasmine Crockett doesn't just confront Hannity, she dissects an entire machine. Anderson Cooper, usually reserved, looked almost stunned as he leaned toward the camera. This wasn't a gotcha moment, he said. This was an excavation. She peeled back layers of media manipulation, political hypocrisy, and corporate greed, and did it without yelling, without name-calling, and without blinking. Behind him, a split screen played, Jasmine poised and unshaking, asking the question that neither Hannity nor his defenders could answer. You don't need to answer me, but you might ask yourself, does what you say at 8 p.m. actually help working people understand who's really taking food off their table? The still frame of Hannity jaw, clenched eyes, averted fingers, locked in frustration, was replayed on a loop. The image became symbolic, a visual of a power dynamic flipped not by scandal, but by truth, by composure. And it burned through the firewall of partisanship. In break rooms, union halls, and Walmart parking lots, Americans who'd never heard of Jasmine Crockett began to ask who she was. Not because she embarrassed a TV host, but because she did what so few dared. She named the system and made its mouthpiece flinch. Still, the machine didn't stay quiet for long. By noon, far-right media outlets launched a barrage of attacks, not on her data, not on her arguments, but on her identity. Breitbart ran the headline, "Crockett plays the victim card again." The Daily Wire uploaded a 10-minute video titled "Fake Outrage from the Left Hannity Schools, Another Woke Congresswoman." And on Truth Social, a coordinated storm erupted under hashtags like Victim Politics, Woke Witch, and Drama Queen Congress. The talking points were clear: deny the legitimacy of her facts by undermining the legitimacy of her voice. Not one article addressed her statistics on Fox's advertising patterns. Not one clip challenged her citation of the Dominion lawsuit. Instead, they attacked her tone, her expression, her silence, anything but her evidence. One radio host sneered, "If I wanted a TED Talk about feelings, I'd go to therapy." Another joked, "Next time, maybe we bring tissues instead of data cards." But that was the problem for them. Jasmine hadn't brought tissues. She brought receipts. And what infuriated them most wasn't that she'd shown the truth. It was that she'd shown it with such unshakable control. There was no viral breakdown to mock, no raised voice to frame as hysterical, no stumble, no misstep. Just a woman seated firmly in her role, calmly cutting through a narrative that had run unchallenged for decades. Meanwhile, independent outlets and advocacy organizations began compiling the segment into toolkits for media literacy campaigns. The ACLU called her "Exchange, a Case Study in Power Accountability." The Brookings Institution reposted her chart, citing it in an updated report on media bias. Even former political adversaries quietly, cautiously admitted, in off-the-record quotes, that something had shifted. Because Crockett hadn't merely won a round of questioning, she had reframed the battlefield. The traditional lines, liberal versus conservative, elite versus populist, began to blur in the wake of her performance. Instead, a new fault line was being drawn: those willing to protect the systems that fail working people, and those willing to challenge them at the source. And Jasmine stood squarely on the latter side. As the firestorm grew, a different kind of response began to bubble up, quieter but more profound. Letters, emails, voicemails, from nurses, from steelworkers, from single mothers, from retired veterans. Messages like, "I've watched Hannity for 10 years, but this time I listened to you. You reminded me who's really been robbing us all these years, and it's not the people on food stamps." One message read aloud the next day by a local Detroit radio host captured the sentiment best. "She didn't ask us to feel sorry. She asked us to pay attention, and now I can't look away." Because Jasmine Crockett didn't play the victim. She played the witness. And in doing so, she forced the country and its media giants to decide what they were willing to see. The sound bites faded, but the resonance deepened. 50 million views in 48 hours had made the hearing go viral. But what followed next could not be captured in view counts or trending hashtags. This wasn't just about a confrontation anymore. It was about interpretation, about meaning, about who controls the frame. And as the noise roared across news cycles and TikTok edits, the nation's leading minds began to ask the question, no chyron dared show, what just happened and why did it cut so deep? At Columbia School of Journalism, the hearing became an unexpected core module. Not in political science, not in ethics, but in media structures and narrative trust. A full lecture was built around Jasmine's questioning. Students gathered around high-definition projectors, and the clip began playing from the moment Jasmine opened her black folder. There was no intro, no professor commentary, just Crockett's eyes, still and unflinching, fixed on the microphone as the first pages turned. Then the screen froze. The professor, a gray-suited Pulitzer laureate, stepped into the glow of the projection and said only one thing. The biggest question here is not who's speaking. It's why the public still believes them. Not a murmur in the room, just the weight of that sentence cracking open the illusion that journalism was still a trusted mirror. One student, a second-year investigative hopeful, raised her hand. But Hannity's statements are often provably false. Doesn't that erode belief? The professor shook his head. We're past the age of fact versus fiction, he replied. We're in the age of emotional allegiance. The facts aren't irrelevant, they're just optional. Over the next hour, that thesis took root in real time. Scholars pointed to data from Media Matters and Gallup. Over 91% of Fox News segments discussing poverty framed it negatively. But beyond the numbers, the lesson was chilling. It wasn't about who was right. It was about who had already claimed the emotional real estate of the viewer. Fox News doesn't sell facts, one guest speaker said. It sells familiarity, a loop that tells its audience, you're the hero, they're the threat. Stay tuned. In this new age, journalism wasn't just a platform, it was a performance of belonging. It didn't seek to inform, it sought to reinforce. And Jasmine's calm, data-driven, razor-precise performance had done something dangerous. It broke the loop. She didn't scream. She didn't sob. She held up the evidence and let silence do what shouting never could. This, educators warned, was exactly why her testimony hit like a rupture. In a joint seminar between Columbia and NYU, students were asked to analyze a single moment, the scene where Jasmine turned to Hannity and said, "Night after night, your show doesn't name the hedge fund that closed their factory. But you do name her." It wasn't just a moral indictment, it was a media strategy dissection made live on national television. Professors drew diagrams on the board: the power of naming in media, the effect of repetition, how television teaches viewers not just what to believe, but who to blame. Then came the second ripple: communications. Theorists stepped in. At the University of Chicago, a study group reviewed Jasmine's line-by-line delivery alongside data from Stanford's Behavioral Perception Lab. Their conclusion, even when Jasmine quoted Hannity verbatim, Nearly 40% of conservative viewers remembered her as being emotionally aggressive, despite her calm tone and controlled language. It's not about how she said it, one analyst noted. It's about what viewers already assumed she meant. This cognitive dissonance, the scholars explained, proved the core problem in modern political media pre-framed interpretation. Viewers no longer saw what happened. They saw what they'd been trained to expect. Meanwhile, in political theory courses, the hearing became a case study in emotional weaponization of information, a term once used for foreign propaganda, now being used to describe American cable news. Professors urged students to examine how talking points, fear triggers, and coded language had evolved into an ecosystem where data had less value than tone. Across multiple campuses, one quote made its way onto whiteboards and lecture slides. "We don't just live in echo chambers. We live in emotional vaults, and only outrage holds the key." And yet, amid the grim conclusions, hope flickered. In a senior seminar at Howard University, a political communications professor turned Jasmine's testimony into an opportunity. Her voice didn't just expose Hannity, it modeled a new kind of civic courage. "This is how you enter the storm," he said, without letting it pull you in. Students discussed her rhetorical pacing, her control, the way she placed truth beside emotion, not in opposition, but in service of clarity. One student, a daughter of a laid-off steelworker from Pittsburgh, raised her hand and said, "That hearing didn't just show us media bias, it showed us what happens when someone refuses to be baited by it." And in that comment, the arc of the moment revealed itself. This wasn't just a viral clash, it was a blueprint, a warning, and a mirror. And now classrooms across America were no longer teaching journalism as the fourth estate. They were teaching it as a battlefield, one where words don't just shape opinion, they shape the emotional terrain on which democracy either rises or collapses. But as academia turned the hearing into curriculum, real money began to vanish from the airwaves. At Fox News headquarters, the pressure hit not like a ripple but like a rupture. It started quietly, an email from a pharmaceutical conglomerate stating that their media team was reassessing the tone of all political programming. Then came the car manufacturer, followed by a major fast food chain. By Friday morning, the damage was undeniable. Over a dozen national sponsors had either paused or pulled their ads from Hannity's primetime slot. Every one of them cited one clip, the showdown with Jasmine Crockett. The corridors on the executive floor were thick with murmurs. Legal advisors clutched documents from the Dominion case, wary of parallels. Marketing directors tracked keyword sentiment spikes, toxic radical bias platform for division. The numbers weren't just red, they were bleeding. The company's advertising arm had already dropped 16% in projected revenue for the next fiscal quarter. In the digital analytics room, someone whispered, "This feels like Carlson all over again." A crisis meeting was called within the hour. Inside the boardroom, far from the gleaming sets and roaring teleprompters, the air was stale with caution. The walls were soundproof, but the tension wasn't. Hannity's name sat in red ink on the whiteboard. His segment was labeled not as news, but as risk exposure. One senior executive gestured to a line graph projecting ad sales for Q4, the curve dove downward like a cliff. Another slid forward a binder stamped Tucker Carlson exit analysis. Everyone knew the unspoken rule: two anchors can't burn down the house in one cycle. Then came the emergency PR proposal, a temporary leave. Not a firing, not a suspension. Just enough time to cool the market, to buy back breathing room, to tell Wall Street we're handling it. By mid-afternoon, Fox News released a one-line statement across all social channels: "Mr. Hannity will be stepping away temporarily to avoid distraction." No explanation, no apology, just distance. The move was surgical, but Hannity wasn't finished. Within hours, a video appeared on his personal X, formerly Twitter account. It wasn't polished. No flashy studio, no Chiron crawl. Just Hannity in a darkened room, flag. Behind him, voice braced like steel under pressure. His tie was loosened, a signal of defiance, not fatigue. His eyes didn't blink. "The left doesn't silence me. Let me be clear, I will be back." That was all he said. 3 lines. No names, no lawsuits, no apologies. But the message wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. Reaction came like a thunderclap. Within minutes, conservative media personalities rallied in defense. Radio hosts, podcast moguls, former colleagues. They called it a witch hunt, a purge, a public execution by corporate cowardice. But they weren't the only ones watching. Mainstream advertisers, stock analysts, and media watchdogs were tracking the response just as closely. In the live market dashboard, CPM rates for the 8 p.m. Fox News slot dropped 12% overnight. Behind closed doors, shareholders convened emergency calls. The question wasn't whether Hannity had said something inflammatory that was old news. The question now was whether he had become unprofitable. Back in the newsroom, Fox's senior producers faced their own reckoning. Segments were reshuffled. Guest lineups were restructured. Some staffers were told to re-edit scripts already approved just days before. Rumors circulated that internal review teams were quietly auditing the editorial slant of primetime monologues. One staffer whispered near the vending machine, "They're trying to find out which sentence cost them $20 million. For now, Hannity was off the air. But the storm hadn't passed. It had only revealed how fragile the fortress really was. The crisis upstairs was still crackling over speakerphones, but the sub-basement corridor beneath Fox's Midtown Tower felt like the building's nervous system had been shut off. Only the emergency lights were on, glowing a nicotine yellow against concrete walls that hadn't seen paint since the Reagan years. Jasmine Crockett's heels clicked once, twice, then softened as she stepped off the carpet runner and onto bare cement, her breath briefly fogging in the overcooled air. She was leaving. She'd already done the impossible in the committee room, already triggered sponsors to yank millions from primetime, yet something unfinished tugged at her spine. A vending machine hummed at the far end, its neon coil slowly turning a single bottle of soda as if time itself were stuck in demo mode. Beside it, half swallowed by shadow, stood Sean Hannity. His blazer was folded over one arm tie, loosened hair no longer camera-ready. He looked like a man who'd stepped out of a war room and discovered the war had moved on without him. For a heartbeat, neither said a word, letting the hum and the distant elevator dings fill in every echo. Then, with a voice so low it barely disturbed the chill, he asked, "Do you think I'm a monster?" Jasmine stopped 3 paces short, the fluorescent tube above them, flickering like a faulty heartbeat. She noticed how his shoulders were half-turned, a fighter's stance, betrayed by exhaustion, and how his left hand kept flexing, still looking for the rhythm of a microphone. She didn't reach for rebuttal or righteous fury. Instead, she opened the slim leather folder she had carried all day, the one reporters never saw because it was personal, not evidentiary. Inside lay a single 4x6 photograph, its edges dog-eared from travel, its surface glossy with fingerprints. She slid it toward him without touching his skin. In the picture, a white man mid-50s sat on the splintered steps of a double-wide trailer outside Odessa, Texas. His face was work-scarred and sun-carved. A grease-smudged Hannity ball cap sat crooked on his knee. Pinned to the step beside him was a handwritten letter of apology, the lines uneven but heartfelt, ending with, "I'm sorry I repeated things I never checked. I'm sorry I taught you that anger instead of love." A child's crayon lines looped beneath in pink. "It's okay, Daddy." Hannity took the photo, the laminate catching the sickly light, and in that instant the hallway felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. His thumb traced the edge, stalling at the crease where the man must have folded it before mailing it to Congress. Jasmine's voice, when it came, was steady, the same scalpel calm that had sliced through hours of televised deflection, but softer now, almost weary. "This man," she said, "listened to you every single night while he changed out of his refinery coveralls. He quoted your jokes, copied your cadence, told his kids who to fear and why. But when the layoffs came and the pandemic took his neighbors, he realized the enemy wasn't the family down the street. It was the system that never said his name until election season." Her words weren't an indictment. They were a post-mortem of faith. She let them hover, giving him space to inhabit them. The fluorescent bulb buzzed, then steadied. He swallowed audibly, painfully, eyes locked on the ink like a man reading his own confession. All the bravado that filled sound stages and stadium rallies seemed to seep out, leaving something smaller, rawer, more mortal. For a moment, Jasmine saw not the architect of outrage, but a broadcaster who had forgotten the line between showmanship and stewardship. The vending machine clicked behind him, dropping a candy bar no one had purchased, its clatter echoing down the hall like an accidental gavel. He looked up the question, still in his gaze, even if the words were spent, and she understood he wasn't searching for absolution, just orientation. Where do you stand when the map you drew for millions is proven false? She answered, the unspoken, her tone, the hush of a verdict. I don't think you're a monster. I just think you forgot there are real people listening to you every night. The line didn't accuse, it revealed. In one breath, she separated sin from sinner choice, from consequence performance from impact. A distant compressor kicked on. The ductwork groaned like a tired animal. Hannity's free hand tightened around the photo until the laminate creaked, yet he didn't tear it. He looked at the floor, no through it, as if replaying every monologue, every graphic, every applause line delivered to an invisible chorus that now looked like this single father in a trailer park. She waited, resisting the urge to rescue him or twist the knife. Silence, she believed, was the only honest instrument left. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Enough for the air to thicken enough for a man who built a career on immediate answers to realize there wasn't one. Finally, he exhaled a sound closer to gravel than breath and handed the photograph back. He didn't apologize. He didn't defend. He simply shook his head, emotion so small it might have been a tremor, and said nothing. Some injuries need noise. Others need quiet. Jasmine slid the picture into her folder, fastened the latch, and stepped aside. He didn't follow. She didn't look back. Two figures moved in opposite directions, one toward the exit, and the long night, the other toward an elevator ride filled with shareholders' questions he could no longer answer with ratings. Outside, the city still roared horns, sirens, neon, the endless churn. But in that basement hallway, the echo faded into a hush so complete it felt like the building itself had bowed its head. And somewhere in Texas, a little girl's crayon apology sat on a refrigerator door, proof that sometimes the loudest broadcast is the one you can't hear. The hallway was nearly empty. No cameras. No aides. Just the low hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the rhythmic distant sound of footsteps somewhere deeper in the building. The hearing had ended hours ago, but Jasmine Crockett hadn't left yet. Not because of the press, not because of protocol, but because something inside her still hadn't landed. And then he appeared. Sean Hannity stepped out from a side door, not flanked by producers or makeup artists. No spotlight. Just a man in a slightly wrinkled suit, his tie loose, his eyes carrying the weight of something he wasn't ready to name. They stood a few feet apart. For a moment, neither said a word. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was charged. Not with hatred, but with recognition. Two people who had just faced off under blinding lights and judgmental eyes. Now stripped of an audience, stripped of applause and outrage, there was only one truth left in the hallway: consequence. He spoke first. Do you think I'm a monster? He didn't smirk. He didn't sneer. It wasn't rhetorical. It was quiet, almost broken. A man asking a question he didn't want the answer to, but needed it anyway. Jasmine blinked slowly, not surprised by the question, but by the vulnerability in it. She didn't rush her reply. Instead, she reached into her folder, still clutched from the hearing. No drama, just a quiet gesture. She pulled out a small photo and held it out. He hesitated, then took it. It was a grainy image. A white man in a dusty work uniform standing on the porch of a modest Texas home. He held a letter in one hand, his daughter's small hand in the other. On the back of the photo was scrawled a date 3 weeks ago. Sean looked up confused. Jasmine explained calmly but firmly. That man used to be one of your most loyal viewers, she said. 10 years, every night. Word for word, he repeated your talking points to his family like gospel. Sean remained silent, but after the hearing last year about labor rights, he started listening to something else, started questioning. And 2 weeks ago, he wrote a letter to his daughter apologizing for the things he said about immigrants, about lazy people, about the world outside his front lawn. Jasmine's voice didn't rise. It dropped into something quieter, heavier, more final. You're not a monster, Sean. I don't believe in monsters. I believe in men who forget there are real people listening to them every night. The words didn't sting like an insult. They hit deeper like a diagnosis. Not of evil, but of neglect. Neglect of responsibility, of power. Sean looked down at the photo again. The man's eyes in the picture were rough, tired, but earnest. The kind of man Sean once claimed to champion. And now he wasn't sure. For a moment, Sean looked like he wanted to say something, defend himself, say it wasn't personal, that he had bosses, that the system was bigger than him. But he didn't, because this wasn't the hearing. This was the reckoning. His voice dropped. I've seen letters like that before. I don't always open them. Jasmine nodded slowly. I know, it's easier not to, but ignoring something doesn't erase what it's doing to people. A pause. Sean swallowed hard. He looked older in that hallway than he had on camera, not just in years, but in weight. Like decades of shouting had finally echoed back into silence. You think I built all of this? He asked, a tinge of desperation in his voice. This rage, this divide. You think that's all me? Jasmine tilted her head. I think you built a stage, and you handed the mic to the loudest voice even when you knew they were lying. Sean looked away. She continued, her voice soft now but unshakable. And maybe you didn't start the fire, but you kept pouring gasoline because it paid better than putting it out. He closed his eyes for a second, just a second, then opened them and said, You think I can fix it? Jasmine stepped closer, not threatening, not pleading, just steady. No, she said, but you can stop making it worse. That landed like a gavel, and neither of them said anything after that. The hallway somehow seemed even quieter now, like the building itself was holding its breath. Behind them, a janitor rolled a mop cart past. Jasmine turned slightly ready to leave, but then she added one more thing, her final words. Not for the cameras, not for the public, for him. We're all being recorded, Sean, even when the red light's off. Not by the networks, but by the lives we affect. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. As she walked away, the photo still in his hand, he stared at it for a long time. That man, that porch, that letter. It didn't matter how many sponsors he had, how many segments he'd aired. That single image, that one moment of regret captured in ink outweighed all of it. He folded the photo, gently, and slipped it into his breast pocket, close to his chest. And in the silence, the hallway whispered with memory, with accountability, with the sound of one man's narrative finally cracking. They called it a hearing, but by the end it felt more like a mirror. A mirror held up not just to one man or one network, but to an entire culture built on volume outrage and selective silence. When the live stream ended, when the headlines rolled, when the pundits dissected sound bites on Twitter and cable, something lingered in the air that no talking point could contain. It was the sound of a country asking itself all at once, what have we become when truth depends on ratings? Jasmine Crockett didn't walk out a hero. She didn't need to. She walked out with something rarer clarity. She had pulled back the curtain not just on Sean Hannity, but on the machine behind him, the money, the incentives, the silent agreements. And in doing so, she hadn't just challenged power. She'd reminded everyone watching who pays the price when truth is for sale. In the days that followed, a quiet reckoning unfolded. Across the country, university classrooms rewound her confrontation like students analyzing a historic trial. Professors played the moment where she said, You don't need to answer me, but you can ask yourself when you speak at 8 p.m., are you helping working people understand who's really stealing their food? And the classroom fell silent, not because they didn't understand, but because they finally did. At kitchen tables in Missouri, in nail salons in Atlanta, in union halls in Ohio, people didn't just talk about Hannity or Fox News. They talked about their fathers, their sisters, their neighbors who stopped trusting science, their cousins who started blaming immigrants for wages, even though the CEO at the top took home $49 million, because that was Jasmine's point all along, not to make a villain out of one man, but to put a spotlight on how easily we all become part of something monstrous when we stop asking who's really pulling the strings. And in that pause, something shifted. One night, a truck driver named Caleb, who had watched Hannity every day since 2009, pulled over to rest in a gas station parking lot outside Tulsa. He wasn't looking for redemption. He was just tired of the anger, of the fear, of believing that his struggles were caused by those people and not the corporation that slashed his benefits. That night, he rewatched the hearing on YouTube, alone in his truck, And for the first time, he didn't hear Jasmine Crockett as a Democrat. He heard her as someone who actually knew what it meant to choose between rent and insulin. Someone who had read the letter from the Missouri mother, not for effect, but because she had to. The next morning, Caleb texted his brother something he hadn't said in 20 years. Maybe we've been yelling at the wrong people. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a beginning. Meanwhile, inside the halls of Fox News, the tension became unspoken policy. Producers stopped running certain segments. Internal memos warned against further personalization of race-based policy debates. Sponsors called to pause ad placements not out of conscience, but because the numbers dipped when Jasmine's clip hit 80 million. Sean Hannity, for his part, went quiet. Publicly, he said little beyond his prepared statement, "I will not be silenced by the left." But in private sources confirmed, he began refusing scripts from staff that contained coded attacks. He demanded to review segments before airtime. He even canceled a planned special on welfare abuse in America. Not because he had changed, but because now he knew someone was watching, and not just the audience, but history, and maybe his own conscience, finally waking from a long slumber. Across town, Jasmine sat alone in her office long after staff had gone. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She did what she always did: read. Letters, emails, voicemails. Most were filled with thanks, some with hate, but one stood out. It was from a 12-year-old girl in El Paso. The letter was written in pencil with smudges and crossed out words. It read, "My dad watches Fox and says, 'You hate people like us.' But I saw your video. You didn't sound like you hate us. You sounded like my mom when she's scared but brave. I want to be like that one day. I want to ask questions that make liars quiet." Jasmine stared at that line for a long time. I want to ask questions that make liars quiet. That's all she'd done. Not destroy, not humiliate. Just ask questions. Real ones. Uncomfortable ones. The kind that don't get applause but get under the skin and stay there. The kind that make people lose sleep, not because they're wrong, but because deep down they know they might be. Outside her window, the Capitol loomed white, glowing, and indifferent. But tonight it didn't feel as untouchable, because somewhere inside its walls, truth had spoken without permission. Not for a headline, but for healing. And not the kind of healing you slap on like a bandage. The kind that begins with bleeding. But what good is a reckoning without a response? Jasmine didn't step into that chamber just to speak. She stepped in to remind us that silence is a choice, and so is complicity. Her words weren't written for applause or applause lines. They were weapons forged not in ivory towers, but in lived pain, in closed factories, in empty lunchboxes, and eviction notices. She pointed a camera, yes. But now the lens is on us. The question is no longer what she exposed. It's what we're going to do with it. Because injustice doesn't vanish once the cameras go dark. It mutates, it rebrands. It shows up in school board meetings, in policy drafts, in the quiet dismissal of truth, because it's too hard to hear. But Jasmine's voice didn't echo for drama. It echoed because it struck something that still hurts. Something real, something undeniable. And if we turn away now, we're no longer bystanders. We're collaborators. So ask yourself, who profits when truth is distorted? Who wins when working people fight each other while billionaires fly free? Who gains when we mock the poor, shame the sick, and cheer the powerful? We need more than applause. We need disruption. We need letters, votes, boycotts. We need to write to networks that spread division and demand better, not just from them, but from ourselves. We need to stop pretending neutrality is virtue. It's not. It's surrender dressed as sophistication. This moment is not about left or right, it's about right or wrong. It's about whether you believe truth should serve power or power should answer to truth. Jasmine Crockett showed us how to confront a machine without flinching. Now it's your turn to decide if you're part of the audience or part of the change. One final image lingers: a mother with a welfare card protecting her child's head. Not a villain, not a victim. A citizen surviving in a system designed to forget her. Until someone somewhere refused to let that forgetting continue. Be that someone. Turn the camera. Lift your voice. And do not let them erase her again. But understand, this disruption is never comfortable. It rattles sponsors. It angers politicians. It risks your friendships at dinner tables where silence used to keep the peace. Yet history was never written by those who stayed comfortable. It was written by people who chose friction over ease, confrontation over complicity. The vote you cast, the letter you send, the boycott you join, these are not small acts. They are sparks. And sparks, when multiplied, become fire. Jasmine Crockett did not walk into that chamber for applause. She walked in to show that even one voice armed with truth can drag power into the light. But light fades if it isn't carried. That burden is ours now. Do not wait for networks to reform themselves. Do not wait for billionaires to develop conscience. Pressure is the only language power respects. So the question remains, will you scroll past this moment or will you claim it? Because somewhere another mother is still choosing between rent and dinner. Another worker is still wondering why his factory is gone. Their silence is not consent, it's exhaustion. Our responsibility is to make sure exhaustion does not become erasure. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.